All right, we're going to start our second session on time. And since our panel stands in the way of lunch, we'll end it on time. Just heads up, everybody, at 1 p.m. But we've got a ways between now and then, and a very, I think, enjoyable set of papers before us. My name is Jeff Nelson. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Russell Kirk Center in Mecosta, Michigan. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a privilege to be here with the sponsors, with Dan and Fisher and Mitch Muncie and EPBC. So thanks to all of you for the time you take to gather us all together and to honor Roger Scruton in this way. Scruton, I had Roger Scruton. I had the privilege to know as an author, somebody I was fortunate to publish in a little journal called the Intercollegiate Review I did a while ago, and then the chance to commission and publish one of his books, The West and the Rest, which still is a very good, excellent book of his, very readable on nationalism and globalism, etc. The West and the Rest. And he was family friends with my father-in-law, Russell Kirk, and spent time with him in Michigan at seminars, and they corresponded quite a lot, and Scruton wrote introductions. So lots of cross-sections. So it's really wonderful for me and for my family and for the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal to be part of all of this. Well, Dominic wasn't able to be here to talk about Atlantic crossings, so I'll start with a little image of one, but in a completely different way, one that didn't actually happen. In the mid-1750s, one of Roger Scruton's heroes, a young Edmund Burke, seriously considered emigrating to the American colonies. At the time, Burke was an aspiring writer. He had just completed his legal studies in 1755. And he had co-written a book on the European settlements in America, and he wrote to a friend of his about his intention to take up an unspecified colonial post, likely in North Carolina. The idea kept its appeal for 2 or 3 years for Burke, or more, until his father stepped in and ended any discussion of it by threatening to cut him off financially. It's always an effective way to get your child's attention, I think. It does not take much counterfactual imagining to wonder what American intellectual and political history might have looked like if Burke had made the crossing and taken his position among the colonial elite, and ultimately perhaps as a founding father. Unlike Burke, Roger Scruton did make the crossing to America, and we don't have to imagine his impact as he immediately took his place among our most influential conservative thinkers. He of course deepened his appreciation and occasional criticism for the American character and traditions underlying America's democratic republic. He chose the rolling hills of Rappahannock County, Virginia, to settle on a historic farm throughout his American years. He wrote about our politics and religion, education and economic arrangements, American constitutionalism, and especially about the customs, allegiances, language, literature, and traditions that forged our civil society and formed the foundation of America's unwritten Constitution, which he was particularly interested in studying, America's unwritten Constitution. It is, quote, history and not the written word, Scruton emphasized, which reveals the Constitution of America. Our speakers this morning will reveal to us, from different perspectives, elements of Roger Scruton in America. To begin that discussion of Scruton in America, I want to just briefly introduce each of our speakers, since we have 3 over here, and as you can tell, there's 4 of it. There is 1 seat missing, or lapsing. So I'm going to sit over here. I'm going to introduce everybody all at once, and then take my place amongst the people until questions and answers. So first, we'll hear from, in a moment, Franz Horcher, who is a historian of political thought, political philosophy, and he is a rich thinker of the relationship between philosophy of art and poetry. He's a full professor, research professor, and head of the Research Institute of Politics and Government of the University of Public Service in Budapest. just flew in from Budapest last night, so he's stalwart to be with us here already early in the morning. And he's a senior fellow of the Institute of Philosophy and the Research Center for the Humanities in the Hun-Ren Research Network of Hungary. He publishes widely on conservatism, liberalism, the history of Hungarian thought, and he is especially a noted Scruton scholar. I commend to you his book, Art and Politics in Roger Scruton's Conservative Philosophy, which was published in 2023, very recently. And, quote, and his piece, Beyond the Window That Can Never Be Opened, Roger Scruton on Moments of Revelation in Human Life, which is available online. So you can Google Ferenc and get some good online stuff as well. He will speak to us on Roger Scruton on the conservatism of the Founding Fathers, and focus somewhat on a surprising candidate for a conservative founding father. Second will be Daniel Cullen. He's professor of philosophy and politics and philosophy of and PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics at Rhodes College, where he directs the project for the study of liberal democracy. He's a senior fellow for constitutional studies at the Jack Miller Center for teaching America's constitutional principles in history, and he serves on the center's academic council. He is the author of Freedom and Rousseau's Political Philosophy, editor and co-editor of Liberal Democracy and Liberal Education, and the author of various essays on modern political philosophy and, of course, on the philosophy of Roger Scruton. And he will address us, consider in part the distinction between empirical and metaphysical conservatism in his talk entitled Mere Conservatism, Roger Scruton and America. And holding up for our team, our relay team here, is Hussein Abukar Mansour. He is an Egyptian American intellectual and a fellow at the Jerusalem Center of Public Relations. He is an author with a career focused on Arab political thought, Arab intellectual history, and the globalization of revolutionary radicalism. He has made important contributions to understanding the intellectual and political dynamics within the Arab world and their intersections with global issues and the Western left. Previously, he served as assistant professor for Hebrew language and culture at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and his writings have appeared in Commentary, Tablet, Mosaic, and other publications. And he'll consider for us Scruton's Western thought and philosophy versus the third world intellectualism and its implications for conservatism. He slightly modified the title if you're looking on your web at the agenda or not, but he will speak to us on the topic, Clash of Ideals, Western Conservatism, and Third World Intellectualism. Okay, there you have it, a very impressive group, so hopefully your anticipation is heightened. And now to get us off and started, Ferenc, you want to go, and we'll go in order after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for this generous introduction, and thank you, Rob and Dan Asia for the invitation. It's great to be here, and I'm happy to contribute to this discussion, which I think is relevant for America and beyond. And I will talk today about a topic which I think is perhaps a little bit surprising, but something which I hope will also shed light on certain aspects that we are underappreciating in Scruton's work. And to do so, I will speak about, just mention a few basic facts about Scruton in America. And then I will focus on two founding fathers and Scruton's views on them, Jefferson and Madison. And I will refer to two of his pieces. One is his Dictionary of Political Thought that he wrote on his own, which is, I think, quite an achievement in any way. And there we have got entries for both Jefferson and Madison. And also we'll refer to his 2017 book, which is entitled Conservatism: An Invitation to the Great Tradition. And that's, again, a place where he keeps referring to Jefferson and to the founding fathers as well. And I will have two conclusions, one about his own position within say, the American conservative scheme, because as Jeff pointed out, he had a place to take here. And secondly, his views on America and the role America plays in the international conservative movement, if there is anything like that. So let me start with Scruton in America. I'm happy that Jeff already mentioned the second time when he spent years actually in the US. That was from 2004 to 2009. When he blew this plantation house in Virginia, in Montpelier, and he even, as we learned, did Burke consider to settle in the U.S. That was after the scandals that he had to get through in his own country. But by 2009, he realized that he has his home in England. In the countryside of Wiltshire. But he spent also quite some time in the early 90s, from 92 to 95, teaching at Boston University. So that means that both in the 90s and in the 2000s, he had a role to play. And of course, it meant something different, because to be at Boston and teaching at Boston University course is different than to stay in Virginia and come up to Washington to research actually, and not so much to teach. So these are the facts that we need to keep in mind. And then the two sources that I want to refer to. One, the dictionary. This is a dictionary of political thought that was first published in 1982 and republished in 96. So this is belonging to his earlier career, after the publication of his breakthrough work, The Meaning of Conservatism. And that's where we have got some references to the founders, i.e. to Jefferson and Madison. And as far as Jefferson is concerned, there is a reference in this. This is a very short entry, just half a page or even less. So you have to be very condensed if you want to say anything relevant. And that's one of the key to Scruton's success, that he could write very economically and very clearly. So he refers to the notes of the state of Virginia by Jefferson in 1784. And he claims that here what is presented is the agrarian mode of life that represents an ideal of the American way of life, the American traditional way of life. And that's, he claims, crucial if we want to understand Jefferson, both in his early period and the period after his political participation in the political life of the nation. And he also refers to stable structures of government in that book, or that text, which means that the crucial aspect for Scruton in this respect is to understand that politics is to have stable structures. It's not so much about nice ideas, but stable institutional structures. A further aspect that he brings up concerning Jefferson's conservatism is his respect for the English common law. This was already mentioned by Jeff, the unwritten constitution, and here in this text he refers to the English common law as something that was respected by Jefferson and which he wanted to keep in the new context, as well as described in the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, which he prompted contained a resume of rights continuous with those implied in the common law. So the idea is to bring together the common law tradition and the new constitutional arrangements of Virginia which is the focus of Scruton on Jefferson. Then there is a reference to what he calls historical particularism. He claims that Jefferson was thinking that to establish a government, you must tailor it to the conditions of a given society, as opposed to to listen to the dictates of the logic of abstract ideas. And in this respect, again, the conservatism comes out, i.e. to try to have ideas that will fit your particular community, as opposed to just the general truth of abstraction. And finally, Jefferson is important for him to have a separate entry on Jeffersonian democracy. And in that entry, he emphasizes federalism as the crucial aspect of Jeffersonian intentions, that the individual states should retain powers against the federal government, and that there is what is here described is the decentralization of power. That's the Jeffersonian ideal of democracy. How about his entry on medicine? It's even less as far as its size is concerned, so it's very concentrated. And the only idea he gives here is medicine the federalist, i.e. He presents medicine as claiming that a federal constitution is always a greater guarantee of stability and freedom than any attempted imposition of a unifying power. So the idea is to have a decentralized power, not in order to make a government less effective. On the contrary, the claim is that it's a greater guarantee of stability for a government to be federal in its structure instead of centralizing it. Okay, so this is the early Scruton on Jefferson and Madison. Let's see the invitation book from 2017. That's just 3 years before he dies, or 2 years before he dies. The first aspect is his description of American democracy. He claims that America, in the comparison with the French experience, American government, American politics is where conservatism began life. That's, I think, a crucial claim. Of course, conservatives do not agree when exactly conservatism was born. And his idea is that it was born in the 18th century as a hesitation within liberalism. That's his understanding, which makes it a very British understanding, I would say. But the claim is that it's not a British invention. On the contrary, it's the American founding fathers who are so important in this respect. Why? Because they could create a government, a system of government where the conservative hesitations began to crystallize into theories as well as policies. So they actually could try out those conservative hesitations within liberalism. And in the American case, a conservative ways of thinking could actually find expression. That's a very powerful general claim. I'm open to discuss how far it is in agreement with what you learned at school or what you think about those traditions. And the founders themselves, we learned in the invitation, were serious people who created one of the most important documents in modern history. So the relevance of the American experience is that it became the crucial document, or one of the crucial documents of modern history, i.e. the role America played in later geopolitical contexts. And in particular, by the 20th century, it became so important that makes the document itself the more significant for the conservative movement all over the Western world and beyond. That's a general description of the American case. And then let's focus on Jefferson. Jefferson is presented here as a conservative in the manner of Blackstone. That's again a very strong and typical Scrutonian description. Of course, Blackstone, as the great lawyer of England and the common law, was never a revolutionary establishing a new system of government. But still, the idea is that the new government is, in fact, as Burke would describe it, a kind of a reform in order to preserve. That's the idea. So the idea is ensuring the continuity of legal order. That's the word that he describes the effort of Jefferson, and that's why he calls him conservative in the manner of Blackstone. And the common law is describing the basic human rights, but in a very particular form. And again, there is a reference here, and in Scruton's work we find such overlaps or borrowings from earlier pieces. So he again refers to the tailoring of the form of government to the conditions of a given society. So the rights are not abstract rights, but the rights that are in connection with the specific tradition of the community. And that's what is described by the common law, which is a better guide to defining rights than philosophical arguments. Again, a very Burkean point, I would say. Political traditions will describe for us our values better than philosophers like myself or Scruton himself. And again, continuity and custom is emphasized when he says that Jefferson is important in the history of conservatism for his insistence on continuity and custom, and also for his warnings against the centralization of political power, i.e. The defense of local government. Why is the local government so important, according to Scruton, for Jefferson? He admits, guided by classical liberal philosophy, but as we learned, conservatism is the hesitation of the liberal tradition. So this is classical liberal philosophy, but embedded into the idea that social membership is a part of liberty. So you cannot have that liberty outside of the certain community that you belong to. So in that sense, you have to embed the idea of the defense of rights into the community that you are part of, or you want to defend the members of that community. And he adds, therefore, Jefferson wished for an America of homesteads and settled communities in which agrarian values would be properly respected and towns and institutions built according to civilized principles. Very straightforward claims again about settled communities, which are crucial for Scruton. We were discussing the architectural connections, but there is this political connections to settled communities. And here he also refers to Jefferson's own interest in architecture, adopting classical architecture and a traditional curriculum in the teaching of the university that he was establishing. the University of Virginia, which emphasized the continuity, again, of the new country with the old order of Europe. So it's not an invention out of the blue in defense of philosophical ideas. It's the defense of a particular tradition embedded into the customs of a particular community, and connected to the land and the art of settling on that land. That's the way that he presents Jefferson's claim. He adds, of course, Jefferson's one major point where you can attack him, and that's slavery. A serious moral flaw, claims Scruton. The slavery he did not defend in his writings, but nevertheless exploited in his life. And that's important in a conservative's case, where it's important that the way of life that you live should be in accordance with your principles. Otherwise, there is a contradiction or a serious problem for your conservatism. And that he admits. That's important for him. Conclusions. I promised two conclusions. One is about Scruton himself, the other one about Scruton on America. The one about Scruton is this. Scruton took a position in the American scene close to the paleo-conservatives. That's the claim. Scruton about the conflict of the neocons and traditional conservatives. So if we want to understand how he situated himself, he had, for a context, the neocon and traditional conservatives. He called them traditional conservatives. I quote, "Although it was normal at first to distinguish the neoconservatives from the traditional conservatives, by the time that he came back second time, the distinction is disappearing. By now almost indistinguishable." That's the claim he makes, which might be regarded as a kind of a tactical move on his side, try to negotiate between the two positions. But one can also argue that it might be a general statement or suggestion for the conservative movement that it should not determine the discussion within American conservatism, that sort of division and the division line between the two camps. But he makes it obvious or explicit when in an interview in 2006 in Orthodoxy Today, he gives his own account of his position in the American context. And it's interesting that the questioner asks whether he would be reserved about being a paleo-conservative, as Russell Kirk was a bit reserved about that. And this is how Scruton answers. "I am not hostile to American neoconservatism, which seems to me to show a commendable desire to think things through and develop an active alternative to liberalism. But I suppose I am more of a paleo than a neoconservative, since I believe that the conservative position is rooted in cultural rather than economic factors." So that's his basic distinction, claiming that the paleos are the ones who were in favor of cultural conservatism or supported a conservatism for which the priority was the cultural issue, and the claim is that the neoconservatives are more on the other side. And this has got two aspects. One is an aspect of the founders, where he distinguishes between a classical liberal position one can associate with Hamilton, and between what he considers as a conservative position and the position of Jefferson. The classical liberals are for market economics, manufacture, and free trade, while conservatives have a vision of settled communities and the family. When they talk about agriculture, classical liberals think about agribusiness, while for the conservatives, it's the attachment to the land and to the centers of civilization on that very land. But so that's the contrast in the original late 18th century context. But there is this update to it in the context of Scruton's own stay in America, as I mentioned in the 90s and the 2000s. And there he says that there is a Jeffersonian defense of agrarian civilization within the conservative movement, and there is a more economic understanding of the conservative case, which is borrowing from classical liberalism. And in that respect, he is, of course, with the first one, the conservative understood as more in favor of civilizational and cultural issues and not so much with economics. And in that respect, he again understands Jefferson as an aesthetician who is in favor of beauty in conservative settlements, while the liberal tendency is to favor utilitarianism and therefore to uglify the cities and settlements to extinction. That's what he claims is the case. So that's the one conclusion. The other one is Scruton on America, and there his strong point is this. In fact, America is the par excellence conservative political tradition. Why? Because the founding fathers had this intention to defend and to guarantee the continuity of the British tradition of the common law and the customs that was established by the common law, and also an agrarian way of life that belonged to that tradition. But also because decentralization and the federation, the system of federation, made it possible to defend local government and the autonomy of the local government. And in that respect, he refers to Tocqueville as his basic reference. I quote, throughout its growth as a modern nation, America has been built from below through the free association of citizens. See Tocqueville, Conservatism as a philosophy of civil society. And that's my last word for this occasion, and I'm happy to look for questions and comments. Thank you.
I'm mindful that perhaps the most absurd occasions of my life were when I had to try and expound Roger Scruton's philosophy with Roger sitting approximately there in the room. Some of my friends have also had that experience. Unfortunately, he's not with us, but I can imagine him looking down and wondering why on a Sunday morning we're gathered to celebrate him. My topic is mere conservatism, Roger Scruton and America, and I'll lay down my IOU for the conference organizers immediately that I don't really have time to get to the "and America," but Ferenc has just done a wonderful, stimulating job on that score. My title, of course, alludes to mere Christianity. And in the preface to that book, C.S. Lewis forswore the intention to assist anyone hesitating between Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, or Roman Catholic denominations. In favor, he said, of explaining to non-believers what had been common to nearly all Christians at all times. And Lewis noted dryly that
disputations of high theology had no tendency to at all bring outsiders into the Christian fold. I don't want to make too much of the comparison because Roger was very much engaged in disputes of high theory, but he did describe his first programmatic statement of conservative philosophy as a work of dogmatics, an attempt to outline a system of beliefs. And I think one can discover an essential or mere conservatism that functions as a leitmotif across his 50 books on topics that would take all of my time merely to enumerate. If I had to reduce what I think of as mere conservatism to a maxim, I would propose Roger's golden sentence: good things are easily destroyed, but not easily created. Conservatism, for him, promotes a culture of affirmation that's called, especially in our times, to respond to a thoroughgoing culture of repudiation. As Roger says in the introduction to his documentary on beauty that's been mentioned a couple of times, mere conservatism, like beauty for him, leads home. My friend and Dan Mahoney's longtime running buddy, late Peter Lawler, once penned what he called a confused student's guide to conservatism, which stopped counting at 9 American varieties, some being versions of classical liberalism. Scruton operated with 2 kinds of conservatism, what he called the empirical and the metaphysical, and their complex relation was Roger's recurring theme. Empirical and metaphysical conservatism both overlap with liberalism, but neither is congruent with it. And this failure of fit, I think, is relevant to the matter of Scruton's relation to the American political tradition. Metaphysical conservatism takes notice of the fact that human beings are self-conscious subjects in a world of objects, living in or between 2 worlds, the natural world and a transcendental realm that eludes description by the natural scientist, but that we experience as a realm of meaning and value in our lives, preeminently in the intimations of sacred things, but even more prosaically in the way a listener, in one of Roger's favorite examples, a listener hears a melody where the acoustician, the scientist, measures and sees only and hears only a sequence of sounds. Why does this matter? Because, he says, our awareness of our obligations has a similar uncanny quality. And here a connection appears to empirical conservatism, because our political life, he says, is always situated somewhere. There is always a given which exerts a claim to our allegiance. In an illuminating passage, Scruton writes, I quote, "The city entered the soul of mankind, and with it a new perspective on each other and on the conflicts that competition brings. The city is not a community of brothers. It is not a tribe or a clan, but a settlement. The city is a community of neighbors who do not necessarily know each other, but whose obligations come from settlement. Having settled side by side, citizens are bound by the many tacit and explicit agreements that they make with each other every day. The city is the symbol and realization of the reasonableness that emerges when the way of the tribe is left behind." Whereas Hobbes concluded that there could be no obligation on any man which arises not from some act of his own, Scruton insisted that we characteristically regard ourselves as burdened by obligations to which we have not consented. We know ourselves to be free individuals, but we regard ourselves as beings living, he said, under the aspect of judgment. the construction of social relations among self-conscious beings like us is founded on reason-giving and reason-taking, whereby individuals recognize one another as inhabiting a sphere of responsibility within which they are answerable for what occurs. For Scruton, whatever real meaning freedom has derives from this fact of responsibility. Freedom, he said, is akin to a metaphysical halo that we attribute to the responsible self who rises above the realm of mere nature and appears in the life world as the target of interpersonal responses such as resentment, anger, admiration, and esteem. The important point here is that for Scruton, the social tie, properly understood, is an individualizing bond, one that unites one person to another in a relation of responsibility. The political ramifications of this view, this transcendental view, are enormous and explain why Scruton staunchly resisted what he calls liberalism's born free fallacy, the appeal to a pre-social state of nature from which conventions, manners, and customs have been stripped so as to recover a purportedly more authentic concept of individuality. While acknowledging that individualism, freedom, and rights were foundational concepts in his own worldview, Scruton rejected this liberal theoretical conceit as a destructive fantasy. And again, I'll quote, and this is somewhat long, but I think it's worthwhile. He wrote, and this was in a brief piece for ISI, Jeff. He writes, any genuine account of our sentiments of legitimacy must begin from the recognition that piety precedes justice, both in our lives and in our thinking, and that until we have attached ourselves to a place and people and begun to think of them as our own, the claims of justice are entirely without meaning for us. But this attachment to place and people is not chosen. It is not the outcome of some liberal reflection on the rights of man, nor is it conceived in the experimental spirit that's emblematic of the socialist program. It's given to us in the very texture of our social existence. We are born into the obligations of the family and into the experience of ourselves as parts of a larger whole. Not to recognize the priority of this experience is to concede the major premise of totalitarian thinking, which is that political existence is nothing but a long-term experiment. In that concern over the state engrossing on the purposeful activities of free civil associations, we can see one way in which what I'm calling mere conservatism or essential conservatism might align with an American conservatism devoted to conserving the liberty of natural rights, provided that the institutions of law and government, as Roger put it, shape the responsible citizen and ensure that freedom is to the benefit of all. So mere conservatism can stipulate the natural justice of equal liberties, which Jefferson certainly did, while reminding that liberal order depends on conservative foundations. Dan Mahoney has written an entire book on this theme that I commend to you. Scruton acknowledged that even though it could not be the ultimate justification for political life, freedom had become a central political value for modern conservatives who fear the tendency of the state to supplant the activity of free associations. He never proposed that the state assume responsibility for social trust or for the production and distribution of social goods. Quite the contrary. and Hayekians can find in his argument for the conjunction of freedom and responsibility an affinity with their own ideas of unintended order. But Scruton rejected as facile and dangerous the notion that we become free by removing the shackles of government, so to speak. As if government, he said, were essentially an occupying power. It certainly was that in the communist regimes of Eastern Europe and elsewhere. But rather, for Scruton, conservatism should be a defense of government against its abuse by, among others, progressive liberals. Government that treats citizens as responsible and accountable does not make them wards of the state in the process of conducting its welfare functions, nor does it arrogate to itself the right to distribute the social product. American conservatives are thus rightly suspicious of a state committed to tailoring social rewards according to its measurement of fairness. But in Scruton's view, the chief danger of the modern state is its propensity to slip the ethos of the nation it governs, and become an alien presence in and over the society it increasingly rules and decreasingly represents. Government then becomes the proverbial faceless bureaucracy. It ceases to be ours and becomes theirs. A free society, however, was more than a collection of people released from moral constraints, for without the latter, social cooperation was impossible. Furthermore, for Scruton, there could be no democracy without a demos, a we, united as a nation in a way that neither extinguishes competing loyalties nor wars against the differences that endure among people who remain sovereign over their individual lives. Following Orwell, Scruton defended national loyalty, and I'm quoting, not as hatred of the other, but as love of what is ours. And who we are, he insisted, was unknowable apart from where we are, which led in turn to reflection on the importance of beauty in the attachment to place and in the congeries of feelings and relationships that make one's country a home. No political order can achieve stability if it cannot call upon a shared loyalty, a first-person plural identity that distinguishes those who share the benefits and burdens of citizenship, citizenship, but not with everyone who is outside the fold. Democracy requires not merely a people, but a nation, and its loyalty, being primarily territorial, requires borders. Conservatism, Scruton said, was born in response to the predicament of the modern individual, severed from history, from custom, from religious usage, and at the same time burdened with a conscious yearning for those things. His wide-ranging criticism addresses this ambivalent consciousness, emphasizing how our relations are made poorer in being remade in the language of contract. In conceiving freedom in terms of the sovereignty of choice and in approaching life as a project of technological mastery, liberal social theory reinforced the scientistic reduction of the human world to a world of things explainable in terms of necessity and chance. So the question for Roger became, can conservatism be an item of contemporary belief for a self-consciously modern person who isn't strongly motivated by national identity or religious or cultural attachment, all of which appear to such a person as mere vestiges of prejudice? The problem is exacerbated by a central paradox of conservatism that Scruton never shied away from, and which he put this way. that our most necessary beliefs may be both unjustified and unjustifiable to ourselves, and that the attempt to justify them will merely lead to their loss. The crucial thing regarding loyalty, he says, is not that we avail ourselves of some eternal community with fixed borders, unalterable beliefs, and a ring-fenced genetic inheritance. What is crucial is that in the flow of human fortunes, there should be a place of belonging which we can identify as home, where the inhabitants can be relied upon, and which we are all committed to defending and improving for the common good. Modern peoples, he said, have learned to tolerate each other's differences, associate rapidly, move freely in and out of relationships, partnerships, faiths, ways of life. We've struck a bargain, he says, to live on peaceful terms without the intimacy of creedal ties or tribal ones. And in a poignant passage, Scruton wrote, "I don't say that this is a good thing, but it's the way things are and the inevitable byproduct of citizenship as I have described it." Thus does conservatism pronounce its benediction on the society of strangers whose relations will not be face-to-face, but merely side-to-side in the manner of neighbors. The conservative patriot is one whose respect is for the laws and the procedures that define his rights and freedoms, and who therefore wishes to relate to his fellow countrymen as citizen to citizen, rather than as members of the same ethnic, religious, or tribal community. But crucially, the we at the center of this political and territorial nationality arises not from a hypothetical agreement of abstract individuals, but out of the attachment of a concrete people to a place and a settled way of life recognized as their own. It is indeed a consensual we, but it is one, he says, that comes into being and endures by compromise and by sacrifice. I'll leave it there, Jeff. Thank you.
Our host was like a good soccer match. We get extra time, 10 minutes. So easy presentation in a short period of discussion. But we have one.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for having me. It's very humbling to speak in a gathering of those who are much more scholarly, established, and achieved than I am. I'm not going to speak about an aspect of Scruton, Scruton's philosophy in the United States. I'm going to actually speak about what I think is one of the most formidable challenges to conservatism, and Scruton's conservatism in the United States, and especially in American intellectualism and high culture. And that is actually third world intellectualism that found one of the most fertile soils in American university and the American academy. For instance, one could make the case that whatever today makes it to Europe actually comes from American university. Post-structuralism have grown, despite the fact that it started in Paris, but have grown specifically in American universities. When I chose a subject of this talk about third world intellectualism months ago, I was afraid that it was too novel or too peculiar for this gathering. How, after all, but by way of some ambitious and perhaps insecure intellectual acrobatics, could the conservative philosophy of Sir Roger Scruton be discussed within the framework of third world intellectualism, or vice versa, in a way that is related to American conservatism? Therefore, I had planned originally to start with an attempt to justify my peculiar choice of topic. However, I had no idea that current events would be so generous in the most unfortunate manner as to make my argument for me in a way much more powerful than I ever could. Throughout the past weeks, we watched as the most prestigious universities in the United States the traditional powerhouses of American intellectual and academic life erupted in angry and violent protests. Students wrapped in Palestinian flags, Palestinian keffiyehs, and armed with an eclectic arsenal of slogans and demands, both from the lexicon of Arab radicalism and decolonization and that of Leninism, descended on the country with the fits of rage and revolutionary hysteria. Supported by the radical faculty that indoctrinated them, students burned American flags, denounced American empire, vandalized historical monuments, and called for a, quote, intifada revolution. Many of them, both faculty and students, unapologetically defended Islamist terrorist groups and had no qualms about the pervasive anti-Semitism in their movement. These events are reminiscent of, indeed, historically related to, the events that first set young Scruton on his path to conservatism. The May 1968 Paris protests, in which students carrying portraits of Chairman Mao, Guevara, and Castro erected barricades, rioted, and attacked working-class French policemen. For all those who are familiar with the life and the work of Sir Scruton, these events were not merely autobiographical recollections, but the moment of the conservative awakening to which Sir Scruton constantly returned. The 1968 revolutionary wave was not just the moment of birth of the most important Anglo-American conservative thinker of his generation. It was also the moment of birth of everything that he would spend the rest of his life fighting. The New Left, the French post-structuralist nonsense machine, identity politics in the United States, multiculturalism in Europe, and which together came to form one of the most serious threats to Western culture and civilization in its modern history. It is exactly this movement which, in a moment of Western absent-mindedness, came to sit on the pinnacle of Western higher education system, which radicalized the Western intellectual and academic life, leading to events and conditions of today. Metaphorically speaking, Sir Scruton's conservatism and the New Left were birthed, just like Cain and Abel, as twins. This mutual origin is not just a matter of historical fact, but also could be attested in the defining character of both: an intense preoccupation with culture and a solid belief that culture matters. A belief that sadly wasn't shared by many liberals, as if liberals and Marxists exchanged custody of what was called then vulgar materialism. As commonly known, the New Left helped materialize both socially and institutionally the fateful pivot of Western Marxism from the preoccupation with the economic base to an obsession with the superstructure. Religion, the nation, sex, art, literature, social habits, customs, etc., all became objects of assault and deconstruction. Sir Scruton, arguably more than anyone, understood what was at stake and spent his life trying to re-educate us on why these things mattered. He also provided us with a compelling philosophical defense of all that of value and worthy of preservation. It is within this rough sketch that we can, and we should, begin to discern the role Third World intellectualism played as a central component of the New Left's assault specifically on what Sir Scruton admired the most, Western high culture, and which came to be crystallized in what came to be known as post-colonialism. A discipline which undermined perhaps more than any other leftist endeavor the Western literary and artistic canon produced by, quote, dead white men. By now, the remarkable success of Third World intellectualism should be visible for all eyes to see. How many of the recent generations of university graduates are more familiar with the works of Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, or Aimé Césaire than they are familiar with the classics of the Western canon? How prevalent is the jargon of decolonization, anti-imperialism, Orientalism, Eurocentrism in our intellectual and public discourse? Not just university graduates, but in primary education, whether under the title of ethnic or world studies, pupils are being cultivated, or rather harvested, to hate and detest the heritage of the societies in which they are born. These developments, now in advanced stages, are not just creating an unpleasant and hostile environment, but are threatening the very historical continuity of Western culture. There are two apparent paradoxes in post-colonial theory, or third world intellectualism at large, and both are embodied in the very persona of the third worldist intellectual migrant that initiated it. To clarify, this should not be confused with the question of migration and assimilation, or the question of mid-century anti-colonialism. The first is a question of the ability to assimilate large non-Western migrant populations, and the second is a question of the political struggle of former colonies in gaining political independence. As a matter of fact, Sir Scruton always took pride in the unique Western openness to outsiders and confidence in the Western ability to turn them into insiders, a task which could be fulfilled only if Western culture does not internalize its own degradation and condemnation. Also, as a Burkean and a believer in local tradition and community, he believed in the rights of societies for independence from imperial domination, whether was it Soviet or Western. The question of the post-colonial intellectual migrant is a different question altogether. Nearly all such men and women are thoroughly Westernized, so much so that they are able to find a place within the Western cultural establishment. Fanon and Césaire spoke and wrote eloquently in French, better than most Frenchmen. Edward Said, thanks to his exceptional Ivy League philological training, was a master of several European languages and could write at length on American, English, French, and German literature and the traditions of criticism. The first paradox, thus, is that the very persona of the third world intellectual, which became central to the New Left's new canon with which the left thought to challenge the Western canon, was, as a matter of fact, indeed a product of the same Western cultural tradition it sought to challenge and subvert from within. The mastery of Western culture, literature, and scholarly ethos was the very ticket that admitted the third world intellectuals, yet they made it their task to shred this ticket to dust. It is nearly impossible to imagine an analogous phenomenon occurring in any other culture. For instance, for a young American to master the heritage of Sunni Islam and the Arabic language, gain a chair at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and use his post to denounce the legacy of dead brown men. Unimaginable. The second paradox emerges in the relationship that post-colonial intellectuals maintain with culture at large. It is biographically notable that individuals like Edward Said were not only connoisseurs of the art, but also artists in their own right, mastering both literary criticism and the Western musical tradition. Many intellectual migrants who since the 1960s have risen to prominence in the Western Academy as professional iconoclasts share this deep passion for Western culture, a passion reminiscent of Sir Scruton's himself. However, herein lies the paradox. Their love, while real, is of a different nature. It often morphs into possessiveness, lacking the very prerequisite of true love, which is freedom. It is the hallmark of Sir Scruton's conservative philosophy, as we heard today, that love occupies a central place in it. For Scruton, art, literature, beauty, and music serve no utilitarian purpose. They are loved for their own sake and invite us into a free communion. It is through this love that they wield their transformative power, elevating, consoling, and reshaping us. Their influence stems not from the prestige they confer, but from the ability to unveil our inherent capacity for and reliance on love, leading us to humbling and consoling self-discovery. For Sir Scruton, this recognition was the greatest gift one could receive and is of a discernibly divine nature. The only fitting response, he believed, was gratitude. expressed not only through reverence, but also through a commitment to preserve and pass on these gifts as they were once bestowed upon us. For the post-colonial intellectual, on the other hand, and often under the influence of the odious cocktail of Leninism, critical theory, and Foucauldian mind-eating nonsense, their relationship with culture takes a form of a warfare, because it starts not from freedom, but from power. Western literature, paintings, architectures, and scholarship are said to be experienced not as a free invitation for communion, but as the yoke of oppression and coercion with which the intellectual must battle until liberation. Thus, the intellectual must not be in Western culture, but against it, repudiating it, through interrogating, critiquing, demystifying, deconstructing, scrutinizing, and scandalizing the ways in which it oppresses us, orientalizes us, dominates us, a lexicon that ultimately reduces all culture to propaganda and war. But how did the third world intellectual arrive at this place? Or was it simply their vocation all along? It should go without saying that no one can master a cultural tradition that they detest or hate. It is simply humanly inconceivable for one to learn to master the language, art, and literature of a culture that one seeks to eviscerate and destroy. The explanation I want to suggest for this relies on the second major contrast between Scruton's conservatism and the endeavor of the post-colonial ethnic intellectual. Indeed, the first contrast of love versus resentment is inseparable and perhaps more challenging from this second one. Sir Scruton's conservatism is inherently local, seeking to preserve a particular world which he found, while post-colonial intellectuals are inherently anti-local, seeking to ride the globalism of socialism and now lift liberalism into the destruction of all particularities. In other words, they want to guarantee their place in the Western high culture establishment by undoing all boundaries that give it its individuality. But without individuality, is there any West left to speak of? I suggest then that we see the vocation of the professional third world intellectual not as a modern heroic epic of liberation, as they like to see it, or a vengeful crusade of destruction, but rather as a tragedy of the overpowering desire to escape the specter of provincialism, leading to resentment, and ultimately to destroy the very coveted object of desire. The tragedy of the third world intellectual is that his career started from a love affair with Western bourgeois morality and culture, a desire to be part of the world of Eliot, Forster, Yeats, Hope, Conrad, and others, yet accepting tools fashioned by the minds of those on the left seeking to cultivate resentment and specifically designed to deconstruct and destroy that very thing that he loved. To escape from particularism, seen in this case as provincialism, into a supposedly humanistic universalism, other than being itself a quintessentially Western fantasy, necessitates more than just the destruction of all boundaries defining the West and its culture, but the destruction of all definitions altogether. The ultimate destination of identity politics is the destruction of all identities, and with that, all the meanings that they provide. The Non-Jewish Jew was a title of a famous essay by the communist intellectual Isaac Deutscher, in which one could already glean exactly such meaning. Deutscher, in his hopes for the triumph of Marxist universal humanism then, was written in the 50s, subverted the very meaning of Jewish identity to become the war on all identities. Sartre's essay on the anti-Semite and Jew, roughly written at the same time, offered an elaborate explanation of this, in which he made identical the transcendence of anti-Semitism with the transcendence of being a Jew or Judaism itself. Edward Said, considered by many the father figure of American identity politics, was particularly fond of Deutscher's essay. And it is this fact that may allow us to see his work similarly as that of the non-Arab Arab, an attempt to transcend to the universal through the destruction of all particulars. not just that of the West's, but ultimately one's own. Just how exactly this transcendence could happen in a way other than doing violence to our every culture and meaning that we inherited, we do not know. Not because we haven't tried, but because there is actually no other way but doing violence. Later in his life, Said often denounced the explosion of cultural warfare, that is the cultural warfare that is identity politics, which he had shepherded, and denied that his work had anything to do with it. I believe I somewhat understand what he meant. For indeed, Said, like Deutscher and Sartre, did not aim at identities fighting each other to the death, but at the dissolution or euthanization of all identities. The only problem, of course, is that the master of reading misread what he actually wrote and failed to see the logical consequences for such abstract universalism. Yet, whether intentionally or not, the deed is done. What Said and his peers had established is a particular kind of ideology that seeped into countless academic disciplines, turning them into modern-day inquisitions for Western literature and history. All that they have to do, the new intellectual, is to third world intellectuals, is to perform the role of the ethnic intellectual, and thus not just abuse the Western heritage they are tasked with humiliating, but often their own cultures and identities of origins, which are then reduced to mere costumes to be displayed for the pleasure of the liberal left polite society. Out of all of this comes a new generation of young men and women trained not to appreciate, but to accuse, not to understand, but to critique, and not to love, but to condemn. Naipaul, a great third world intellectual, once said, "The world is what it is, men who are nothing, who allow themselves to become nothing, have no place in it." End of quote. He wrote this as a prelude to one of his novels that delved into the psyche of the very type of the third world intellectual I discussed today. Naipaul encapsulated the profound despair of those desiring a significant place in the world, in a world seemingly indifferent to their own aspirations. Today, might we say that it is Western conservatives who are confronted with the risk of becoming nothing in their own cultural landscape? This fear, I propose, is a central driver of a lot of current conservative action in the culture war here in the West. What is the future of Western conservatives? Are they to become merely another distinct group within a culturally diverse but a fragmented society under officially administered cosmopolitanism? Or is there a way to reaffirm and extend the foundational values of the West, not out of fear, but through the love and gratitude that Sir Scruton championed? Western heritage, traditions, culture, and artistic treasures should not be seen as spoils over which to battle, but rather as a generous invitation to join and share, which are crucial for their preservation. Roger Scruton's life and ideas were a response to the world as he saw it in his time. Now we must formulate our own response to the world as it unfolds today. If conservatism is to have a future, it must not only defend, but also assertively invite and integrate those who have been led to believe that their only place within the Western culture is that of a destroyer of its traditions. For too long, only the left has sought to harness the dynamic intellectual energies emerging from the third world, energies that have driven the decolonization enterprise to its current prominence at the heart of Western culture itself. If the treasures of Western culture are to be preserved, conservatives too will have to take a page or two from the left's playbook and learn how to build and institutionalize what it is they seek to teach and insist on inviting the new members to our societies. I would argue that it is exactly this realization that animated all the thought of Sir Scruton since he started his own conservatism in 1960. Thank you.
Yeah, just some quick remarks. By the way, they were all great presentations, lots of very suggestive advice. Ferris, the thing that struck me in your very, I think, accurate encapsulation of Scruton on Jefferson is how he completely abstracted from that facet of Jefferson's thought that's most problematic for conservatives, namely his rather limitless partisanship for the French Revolution. He actively discouraged the Frenchmen he knew from, you might say, moving in English direction from a mixed regime and constitutional monarchy. He praised the terror that was late as 1793. He certainly didn't show any diminution of revolutionary zeal. And given the fact that the critique of the French Revolution, a very form, particularly the French Revolution, was so central to Scruton's own conservatism, it strikes me as something of a mystery, this perfectly conservative way they
In addition, I mean, Jefferson was not a continuity thinker when it came to generation, right? Because he famously argued that the generation owed nothing to the future, and he did it in legal argument. So I hear your opinion. It's curious.
Yes, thanks, Dan, for that. Of course, Scruton is aware of the different Jeffersons that we own. And he tries to show that, in fact, what happens in the interpretation is to try to cherry pick the ones that you need for your own theory. But he said that, well, the liberals are doing it. We are also entitled to do it. As we learned, we have to take over some of the tactics of the left. And he also pointed out that although there are those parts of Jefferson, there is a continuing or returning reference to the continuity, the early one and the late Jefferson both concentrates on the Virginia context and not so much on the universal rights. As for Jeff's point, I would say that of course this claim of Jefferson might be understood different ways again. And I would suggest that it can, in fact, be understood in a conservative way, which is that, in fact, it is really true that no generation should be excluded for the reinterpretation of the very tradition they are members of. And in fact, that's the first priority for the survival of a constitution, that each generation has the opportunity to add their own added value to the line of interpretation.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm glad that Dan brought up the French Revolution because my question has something to do with that. There's an interpretation of the American Revolution and its relationship to the French Revolution that says what happened in Paris in the 1790s happened because of what happened in America in the 1770s. And I think today a lot of reactionary or post-liberal thinkers share that view of the American Revolution, sort of are of the view that what it unleashed on the world led to things like the campus protests that we're seeing, or transgenderism, or any number of other sort of deconstructions of the Western tradition. And some of the panelists seem to think that there's something in America that mitigates against that. But I wonder, from a sort of Scrutonian perspective, how can we answer that kind of post-liberal critique of the American Revolution or the American founding?
I think that Scruton, if I may, but I'm sure that my colleagues will add to it. I think that Scruton would be very definitively against such interpretations, because what he claimed as I guess the reasonable man of his time also claimed, was that in fact what the American founders were doing was rather to keep to the tradition that was the British tradition, i.e. that you need to be able to contribute to the decisions that you are part of, and that refer to your own future. And I think that's not against that tradition that is presented by the founders, but it is based on that very tradition that they wanted to have their say. I.e., it's just the same as he claims about the settlement, that the people who are living together in the neighborhood should decide the thing together. And if you are excluded from that, even though you live there, it's impossible to do. So Britain and America in that respect was too far away. It was not the same locality that caused the problem.
Yeah. Just briefly, I think there's of course much truth in what Franz has just described as Roger's interpretation, but I think there's also a real problem with this account of the American founding. For one thing, Roger doesn't sufficiently notice, I'd say, the act of founding, that there's something very non-traditional, something self-consciously innovative, and very close to an idea that he always thought was a fundamental danger in politics, and that is the appearance of the legislator. Well, the founders were, in a real sense, classical style legislators. Jefferson, of course, counted among them. But the most anti-Burkean sentence ever penned was probably that the earth belongs to the living. And one last thing, it seems to me that Roger perhaps just missed Federalist 49, where Madison articulates a deeply conservative view that this Constitution will not be sustainable unless it is accompanied by a spirit of veneration on the part of the people. But that very point was provoked by Jefferson's, harebrained idea that we'll just have a constitutional convention as the occasion requires.
Just a very, very brief comment. This is not within the area of my expertise. I focus primarily on third world intellectualism and the New Left, things of that sort. And I'm familiar with a lot of the post-liberal critiques that you're talking about. What really strikes me about those critiques, and I want to comment on this part, is the kind of this linear history on which, what we're seeing today is just unfolding of something that has been latent the entire time. As an intellectual migrant myself, from Egypt, I work with Arab political thought, continental philosophy, and now I live, I'm becoming an American conservative. I know that things don't work that way. The things that you mentioned, identity politics, transgenderism, things of that sort, these developed in very complicated global context. For example, there are a lot of books that came recently discussing the origin of identity politics and whether it was, I don't know, the civil rights movements or some legal developments that happened in the United States in the 1960s, affirmative action, for example. An issue that, like the one that I spoke about today, is completely undiscussed. Third world intellectuals. Edward Said, the father figure, the guy was with the Palestinian, was born in Egypt. Nobody mentions that this is even a part. This is something about liberalism, within liberalism, contained within liberalism. I am a conservative, not a liberal, but I don't think that this is actually how these things developed, and this is why I don't agree with these critiques.
I read a small book called The Weak Interpretation of History by Herbert Butterfield on just this topic. We got one final short word.
Yes. That's about the issues that were brought up concerning Jefferson and his anti-Burkeanism. I think that we are in a difficult position because we had a lesson of reading Jefferson in our schools and by our seniors, and I think that what Roger offers is in fact an alternative way of approaching our ancestors or your ancestors, and in that respect, I think that's a crucial thing. And I don't agree that there is no such legislation before in the American experience. I would say that the majority of the states had the same experience when they had to establish their constitution for themselves. So it was a living tradition by that time.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoyed it. Yes, it was enjoyable. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that was